Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me as one of the nominations for Best Photo Book. I'm coming at you from San Francisco, California. I was Jim Marshall's assistant for the last 13 years of his life, and when he passed away, he had no children, and he left me his entire archive. So I have the awesome job of keeping Jim Marshall's legacy alive. So.
Bonsoir à tous. Alors moi je suis Matthieu Conquet, je suis en charge au FILAF depuis 3 années de la sélection livres musicaux et cette année on a choisi avec les membres du jury de proposer ce très très beau livre. Alors je montre avec l'objet pour que vous ayez une idée, puisqu'en fait voilà, vous voyez c'est un peu comme un objectif de photo, de présenter ce livre Jim Marshall, Show Me the Picture, images et histoire d'une légende de la photographie. Jim Marshall, c'est un photographe américain né en 1936, il est mort en 2010 et Amelia Davis, comme vous l'avez compris, est en charge de toutes ces archives. Alors je reviens pas sur la qualité de légende de Jim Marshall parce que c'est vrai, il a vraiment photographié toute la scène musicale qui compte, ou presque aux États-Unis, ou en tout cas dans le monde anglophone, entre les années 50, 70, Miles Davis, Janis Joplin, Johnny Cash, le festival de Woodstock, bien sûr, Monterey Pop, Jimi Hendrix en train de brûler sa guitare, la fameuse photo, elle est signée Jim Marshall. Alors on voit sur la couverture du livre, vous voyez là, c'est Peter Frampton qui est en train de sauter au green, au Day on the Green, c'est un festival gratuit à Auckland. Et puis au revers, de l'autre côté du livre, c'est pour donner une idée au jury qui n'ont peut-être pas tous l'objet sous les yeux, de l'autre côté du livre, c'est un portrait de Jim Marshall. Voilà, ça donne une idée du personnage. Et ma première question, elle va à Amelia Davis. Quelle forme, et je pense notamment à cette forme-là, quelle forme est-ce que vous vouliez donner à ce livre? Est-ce qu'avec cette idée d'objectif, il y avait celle de rentrer dans le boîtier, peut-être, dans l'appareil de Jim Marshall? What form did you want to give to this book? I'm talking about form because the book itself looks like an objective, like a photograph, a camera. Is the idea to be inside the camera?
Yes, absolutely. You got it right. We, when the publisher and I talked about the format, we wanted it to feel almost like a record, an album. But so that's the format we did. Rather than being high, we did it wide. And also we wanted the feeling of looking through Jim's lens. So we wanted to give everybody a glimpse into Jim's world and kind of see through Jim's eyes how he documented the world around him. So I'm glad you said that. That's exactly what we were trying to do.
Alors vous avez rencontré Jim Marshall en 98, vous le raconterez dans le chapitre The Care and the Feeling of Jim Marshall, s'occuper et nourrir Jim Marshall. À l'époque, vous étiez étudiante en photographie et je crois que vous travailliez sur des personnes qui survivaient à des cancers du sein. Quel genre de photos vous intéressait à ce moment-là? Parce que je crois que vous n'étiez pas familière avec le travail de Jim Marshall. You met Jim Marshall in 1998. You're telling this story in the book. At the time you were studying photography and especially you were doing something around breast cancers. I wonder, what did you know about him and about his work at the time?
Well, Jim was a family friend, my family's friend. He was their uncle. The whole time I was growing up, I never met Jim. I didn't know him. It wasn't until my friend's 30th birthday party that I was invited to, and Jim was there. I was studying photography, but I was studying fine art photography, so I didn't really know who Jim was. I knew who Helen Levitt was, Cartier-Bresson, people like that. So when I went, there was this little man with a Leica around his neck. He shuffled over to me and he said, "Hello, I'm Jim Marshall." And I said, "Hello, I'm Amelia Davis." And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a photographer." I said, "What do you do?" Because I had no clue who he was. So he said, "I'm a photographer." So we started talking, and I told him I was involved in a breast cancer book I was doing because my mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer at that time. And I thought it was really, really important to show. This was back in 1998 when photos of women weren't really shown with breast cancer. So it was important for me to do that. I told Jim, he said, I think that's really, really important. I support what you're doing. A lot of my friends have had breast cancer. He said, where do you live? And it turns out we lived a block away from each other in San Francisco. And then he looked at me and he said, wait a minute, are you gay? And I looked at him and I said, yes. And he goes, oh, I'm always attracted to gay women or married women. And I looked at him and I said, that's your problem, not mine. And he laughed and he said, I think we're going to be really good friends. And from then on, he called me the next day. We had coffee and he said, come to my apartment. He opened the door and the hallway was lined with one iconic image after another. Beatles' last concert, Jimi Hendrix burning his guitar, Mick and Keith, the Rolling Stones. And I just looked at him and I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. And he said, well, that's why I liked you. And from then on, I worked for Jim Marshall. And Jim never had any children. His life was photography. And so he considered his photos and his archive his children, and he protected them fiercely when he was alive. And so when he passed away, I knew he was going to leave me his children. And so I inherited over 1 million children when Jim passed away. And it's my job to really share those children with the world and show how relevant a lot of them are right now, because history tends to repeat itself. And right now we're going back into that arc in the 60s where a lot of things that Jim had documented are happening again. And Jim always thought of himself as a reporter with a camera. And the purpose of this book as well is many people, I'll go down and show you guys. We did a documentary on Jim, actually, which premiered last year. And that was really one of the reasons we did the book as well, because the documentary dives deep into who Jim was, how he grew up, how he started taking photographs. And through that, we then can see how this man developed his style and carried it into many different parts of his work. So the book is a standalone book as well. We wanted it to be a standalone book, so if you hadn't seen the documentary, you would still understand the book and appreciate it. But that's really where the book came from, was, from doing the documentary and taking a deep dive into Jim and who he was. And most people know Jim for music photography. And for example, this is the Grateful Dead, their last concert in the Haight. This is Cream, Peter Frampton, Day on the Green, Beatles' last concert at Candlestick Park, Jim Morrison from The Doors, Mick and Keith, Exile on Main Street recordings. There's Jim and I. But Jim was more than those iconic photos. And that's why, again, we get into this book. And here was Jim at Woodstock. He always had camera. Photography was his life. He literally always had 5 or 6 cameras around him because he always wanted to capture everything. He didn't want to miss a moment. So even when I met him, he was older. The first thing he would do when he walked out of the house would pick up his Leica camera and put it on his shoulder. It was just habit because he always had it. And this is Jim photographing Earth, Wind, and Fire, actually. Here's Jim with Carlos Santana. He became very good friends. And one of the reasons Jim had such great access with people was because they trusted him and he was their friend. This just illustrates that photography was Jim's life. And then I kind of wanted to go in, if I may, to really early photography of Jim. He was completely self-taught. He bought his first camera in 1959 and literally taught himself. And being in San Francisco, this is from 1960, jazz was huge in San Francisco in the North Beach area. So Jim went down to the North Beach area and started taking photographs. And that's where he met John Coltrane. And with John Coltrane, he developed a lifelong friendship. And this particular photo, I think, is so great because it's what Jim was the best for, I think, was showing somebody in a moment and they don't know you're there. So this is really Jim capturing the decisive moment, like Cartier-Bresson would say, and he's completely unaware that you're there. But also with Jim's photography, you get a sense of being a participant because you do feel like you're right in there with John Coltrane. I never feel like a voyeur looking outside in. I always feel like I'm there. And that was another unique part of Jim's photography that he really honed in early on. And then Jim in 1963 lived in New York from 1962 to 1964. And this was John Coltrane in Queens, New York, in his backyard. So again, you get this extremely intimate photograph and you feel like you're there watching the sunset with John Coltrane. And then through John Coltrane, he became very good friends with Miles Davis, another big jazz icon. And they became very good friends. And Jim was an immigrant. His parents immigrated to the United States. He was Assyrian. And so he always felt like an outsider. He never felt like he fit in. So he was always attracted to the underdog and African-American musicians because he could relate to them, that they weren't getting the same kind of attention that they should have as a lot of the white photographers. And so he really gravitated towards the underdog and people like that. And so he developed a great friendship with Miles Davis. Miles Davis was a boxer. A lot of people don't know that. And he'd always say to his sparring partner, "Don't hit me in the mouth. I got to play tonight." But this is such a great photograph as well, really just intimate. You know you're there and you feel like you're in the boxing ring with him. But then going back to early on in San Francisco, he also photographed Ray Charles. And this is another amazing photograph from 1960. Again, here, Jim was really known for using natural light. He never liked to pose people. He never liked to use lighting. He always used what was available. Yes, that one. Can everybody see that? There's another example of a woman that's listening to the Ray Charles concert. And again, it's just, using the light that is available. And what's amazing to me too is Jim used a completely manual camera. We're so used today to using automatic cameras. It was completely manual, and Jim knew his equipment so well that he knew if he set it at the right f-stop, the right, film speed, he would get that photograph.
You always use the Leica M2?
It was Leica M4 was his favorite, but he did use the Leica M2. And the Leica was, anybody who knows cameras, it's a hard camera to use. So again, by Jim going out and shooting and learned what worked and what didn't, he taught himself. So he knew the camera like it was an extension of him, and was able to really capture a fleeting moment. Like here's in Market Street in San Francisco, a woman was putting on her hand cream and Jim caught her, and she caught him catching her in there. Again, this is North Beach in San Francisco, and there they are, just a fleeting moment. This is, to me, this is a very powerful, again, harkens back to today, what's happening. San Francisco the United States was segregated during the 60s, and this was a lunch counter, and it just speaks volumes. You've got the white women and the African-American man who's turned away, and they're oblivious to the fact that he is right there with them. And Jim it says so much as to what was happening at that time. And Jim was always attracted to children. And my theory was that Jim never had children, right? The photography were his children. And so he collected his children throughout his life in his photographs. And he always, if you look on every single roll of film that Jim took, there's always a child. So this is collecting some of his children, I think. And then again,
Amelia, Davis, vous disiez que les photos de Jim Marshall ont une résonance avec l'Amérique d'aujourd'hui. J'aimerais bien que vous nous fassiez voir des photos du Kentucky, parce que c'est une série de photographies qu'il va aller faire à Hazard pour documenter, pour illustrer un reportage sur la pauvreté aux États-Unis. Et si on pouvait en voir un extrait, je pense que ce serait intéressant sur ce que ça montre de l'Amérique à l'époque et puis aussi de la politique de Jim Marshall. Could you show us some photos from Kentucky, because I think it's relevant today voilà, Bob Dylan, bien sûr.
I'm going to have to go through all these to get there, but they're coming up. This is Bob Dylan in 1963, and I'll just tell briefly, this was Bob Dylan. He just picked a tire up and started rolling it. It was not set up at all, and Jim got it. Jim also photographed the peace symbol from its inception throughout the 60s. Again, seeing a symbol as a very important force that was going to represent many different things. And not many people thought of documenting the peace symbol throughout the 60s, but Jim did. Wherever it showed up, he would document it, whether it was graffiti or, in a guitar case. This is the street photography Jim did in 1963. A young John Lee Hooker. There's another John Coltrane listening to playback. And here we get to the Kentucky. Jim in 1963, when he was living in New York, also went down to Hazard, Kentucky, to photograph a coal mining town. Jim embedded himself into that town and gained the trust and respect of the people there. And these are just some of the most beautiful photographs I think that Jim has taken, because he's showing them, but he's also showing you the truth, the way it is. He's not hiding from the truth. So he used his camera as a tool to shine a light on poverty in America and income inequality that was going on, which is still happening today in the United States and around the world. But he was not exploiting them. He was using his photos to really shine a light on a very important thing. And the writer did not go down to Kentucky with Jim. Jim took the photos. And so when he went back to the magazine, the writer looked at Jim's photos and then wrote the story, which was very condescending and saying these people were poor and dirty. And Jim was so angry. He said, that is not correct. He pulled the story. He said, I am not going to let you guys publish this story because you're wrong. These people were very proud. They were human beings. And this is something that I'm not going to let you degrade. And so he pulled it and gave the story to a different magazine. Mm-hmm. And if you see the black around their mouths, that is not soot. What it is actually coal sores from inhaling the coal. It actually left marks on their skin. Here's a father with his sons from Kentucky. But a lot of people, again, when people say Jim Marshall, you don't think of these photographs. You think of the Grateful Dead or Mick and Keith. But the reason he got those photographs was because he traveled through this and took these photographs to tell a story. And I think one of the most important things about, now we get to the folk festival with Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, a very young Bob Dylan. This is just when he was being introduced. But again, from his previous photographs that you saw, you feel like you're a participant. They have no clue that Jim is there. And he captured that moment, a very intimate, fun moment between Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. And then we get to, this is the Newport Folk Festival in 1963. And they were doing a trial march on Washington at the Newport Folk Festival because they could contain it so well. The next month was the actual March on Washington, and Jim captured that because he was down there photographing the music and Joan Baez, and he captured this other historic moment that was going to be happening in American history. So I like to say Jim may have been there for the music, but he stayed for the history and really documented And it shows also that Jim had a curious eye. He might have been there for the music, but when they stopped performing, Jim kept photographing, and he photographed everything else that was going on around that folk festival, not just the music.
Ouais, ça, c'est ce qui est vraiment très intéressant quand on regarde ce livre et surtout tous les textes qui l'accompagnent. Il n'y a pas que l'iconographie qui est riche, hein, la légende est très riche aussi. Et vous racontez bien, c'est intéressant de lire aussi les textes qui expliquent le goût pour la photographie inutile chez Jim Marshall, qui ne cherche pas forcément à avoir une photo qui sera rentable et qui sera utilisée immédiatement par un magazine. Et vous l'avez dit, il refuse même parfois que sa photo soit publiée puisque le texte ne correspond pas à la réalité qu'il a photographiée. I just resume what you said, and it's important to mention that Jim Marshall was also involved in unuseful photography for himself that you discovered later in the archives that were never published. That's the interest of the book. C'est aussi l'intérêt de ce livre. I would like to talk about fingers because they are we see them a lot in the book.
Yes.
On voit beaucoup de doigts tendus dans ce livre. Il y a celui de Johnny Cash qu'il fait à la prison de Saint-Quentin. Il y a énormément de pochettes d'albums qui seront signées de Jim Marshall et celle de Johnny Cash qui sortira très tard, hein, parce qu'au début, cette photo, on ne voulait pas la mettre en avant. Mais elle est importante et il y a beaucoup de doigts qui vont revenir. Et moi, je pense que c'est important parce que ça donne une idée de la personnalité très forte, excessive aussi de Jim Marshall. C'est important, vous le dites, de ne pas cacher non plus sa passion pour les armes. Il va avoir beaucoup de problèmes avec la police parce qu'il possède toujours des armes sur lui, même au moment où tous les hippies sont à des concerts très cool. Lui, il a toujours une arme sur lui et il pouvait avoir des propos extrêmement conservateurs, extrêmement provocateurs. Et en ça aussi, ça résonne beaucoup avec une Amérique d'aujourd'hui. Il y a beaucoup de paradoxes dans la personne de Jim Marshall. Jim Marshall was also a very paradoxical person because he was pro-weapons, he was very conservative, he was very provocative. So, Inger, he tells a lot about the person.
Jim, yes, he was a controversial figure, and you either liked him or did not like him, and the same was with Jim. So I like to say that if Jim loved you, he would go in front of an oncoming truck because he loved you so much. If he hated you, he would be the driver in that truck that ran you down. So that's how Jim lived his life, no regrets, and that's how he was in his photography too. It was really true and vibrant and lifelike. So Jim's I like to say was his hello and goodbye was flipping the bird. And I'm going to have to let me go to, well, hang on, before we do that. With flipping the bird, Jim's famous one is Johnny Cash flipping the bird. And that was, Jim and Johnny Cash had a great relationship. And Jim photographed Johnny Cash's live concerts at Folsom and San Quentin prison. And he was the only photographer for those two concerts. And the reason he did that was because he developed a great friendship with Johnny Cash, and Johnny Cash said, I want Jim Marshall to be my photographer for these two live concerts. And the whole reason he did the concerts at the prisons was to shine a light on prisoner reform. And the famous flipping the bird photograph was in rehearsal, sound check. Jim said, hey, Johnny, let's do one for the warden. And Johnny Cash flipped him the bird. So that was a kind of a running theme throughout Jim's photography. But to switch tracks, I wanted to get back to Jim. This is when JFK was shot dead. And Jim was in New York at the Time Life building. And they said to all the photographers at the time, just go down into the streets and photograph what you see. And I think here it just shows the shock and devastation of everybody when they found out that their president had been shot and killed. This is some of his civil rights photography. Again, this is in the South where they still had colored bathrooms and drinking fountains. Mississippi, yes. And this is where they were signing up blacks to vote with in the very rural counties, which again is happening. And this is Miss Cheney. Jim was there. I don't know if you knew the story during Freedom Summer when 3 of these students who went down, one was black, the other 2 were white, went down to Mississippi to sign up blacks to vote, and the Ku Klux Klan kidnapped them and killed them. And this is when James Cheney, who was the African American, this is when the FBI told her that her son's body had been found, and Jim captured that moment. He also photographed a lot of Bob Dylan. This is Bob Dylan in 1965 when he came to San Francisco to announce that he was going electric. And people were up in arms because he had always used his acoustic guitar. This is the early Rolling Stones when they came to San Francisco in 1965. So before they kind of became the bad boys. And they played to a half-empty stadium in San Francisco. That would never happen today, would it? But again, showing the different angles, Jim chose to photograph them from the back and show the crowd. Again, photographing all angles of what was happening. Then you come into San Francisco during the counterculture explosion of, the Summer of Love, basically 1967, 1968. So this is Jefferson Airplane walking down the street in the Haight-Ashbury. And then you get Jimi Hendrix. This was after Monterey Pop. He drove up to San Francisco and did a free concert in the Panhandle. And again, I just love this perspective because you're there looking out at the crowd with Jimi Hendrix. I mean, I feel like I'm standing right next to him. But this would never happen today. The way music photography has changed, where you have handlers, you have gates, nobody could be leaning on the stage like they are there. It just shows a time when it was so different than what it is today. And this was a famous shot of Jimmy Cash. This was at Monterey Pop Festival, 1967. A lot of people think this was a live shot, but it was actually during sound check. And Jim was the only photographer there because all the other photographers wanted to go have dinner. And Jim said, I'm going to stay here. I think something's going to happen. And Jimi Hendrix hit a note that he just loved, and Jim captured it. Again, if Jim weren't there, he would have never gotten this photograph. And this is him burning his guitar, famous. He wrote his name down that day, Jimi Hendrix, by burning that guitar at Monterey Pop. And Jimi Hendrix said to Jim, I hope you have a lot of film in your camera. And Jim said, why? He goes, just make sure you have a lot of film. And he got him burning his guitar. And this is Monterey Pop again. You've got Dennis Hopper. You've got Brian Jones from Rolling Stones. You have Nico. And you have, not Crystal Gayle, I always want to call her Crystal Gayle, country singer. But what's great about this is Dennis Hopper was actually a photographer himself, and he modeled his character from Apocalypse Now after Jim Marshall, from just, this crazy photographer with 5 and 6 cameras around his neck, running around taking photographs of people. And so that's how he saw Jim. He was the only photographer to photograph Janis Joplin and Grace Slick together in one.
Censé être rival. They were supposed to be enemies, but not at all.
No, they were the two women of rock and roll, and they loved, the media liked to make them out as arch enemies, and they weren't. They actually were very good friends. And so Jim one day said, I want to photograph the two of you, and they let him in. And here they are again. And then this is a famous shot of Janis Joplin with her Southern Comfort bottle backstage on her psychedelic Porsche. And then we move to the Johnny Cash, which we were talking about. This was at Folsom State Prison when they first went into the prison for the concerts. And I think it's just so powerful. It's how it felt. You were surrounded by gates, and it clanked when they were locked in. So this just kind of gives you that feeling. And then another different perspective of Jim's photographing up, but I think it's wonderful. It really shows the iconic giant that Johnny Cash was by photographing it from below. Here he is on stage with June Carter waiting for him in the background. And here's that famous finger shot that is probably the most ripped off photograph in the history of photography.
Avec sa belle-mère derrière, with in his back, it's Mrs. Carter.
Correct. Yes, that is June Carter's mother in the background. So John Carter Cash, Johnny Cash's son, said this is funny for him because it's one of the most rebellious photographs ever taken. And it's his father and his grandmother who's just passing in the background and didn't know that this was happening. And then here's Johnny Cash and June Carter. And I love this one again. This is just a very intimate moment that Jim was able to capture. And you can really feel the love between the two of them. They had no idea that Jim was right there. And this is Bob Dylan. Johnny Cash had his own TV show from 69 to about 71. And Bob Dylan played on the TV show. They were actually very good friends. And Johnny Cash asked Bob Dylan to be the first guest on his TV show. This is Woodstock. Again, now we go to the late part of the 60s. And this was taken with an orange filter, and Jim climbed the rafters and just gave you the whole vibe of what was going on.
Il a eu le courage de monter sur les échafaudages parce qu'il avait pris de l'acide avec un musicien, sinon il avait le vertige, il ne l'aurait jamais fait. We are learning, reading the book, that he had the courage to climb because he was on acid. Usually he would never do that.
He would never do that, that's right. The Grateful Dead were notorious for dosing people with acid and them not knowing it. So the Grateful Dead had dosed him Jim's drink, and he was afraid of heights. And so he said he felt like he was a monkey. He thought he was a monkey and could climb the rafters, and that's the only reason he got that. And it was also the breakout performance for Carlos Santana. And Carlos was also on acid, and he was wrestling. He thought his guitar was a snake. And so he was wrestling with the snake when he was playing. Grateful Dead, not the Who. This is the Who at sunrise at Woodstock. Again, all natural light. Just captured the moment. Jefferson Airplane. Whoops. Then you get Sly Stone, who was also at Woodstock. Janis Joplin. The crowd. You don't see a lot of crowd shots from Woodstock, but Jim did that. And this is the famous cover of Newsweek magazine of two people dancing at Woodstock. This was Altamont, which was 1969, and this really, really ended, I think, the 60s in violence. Altamont was not a success. There was a killing. It was just poorly thought out about where it was going to be. You could barely get in and out. So it was just a disaster waiting to happen. But this is Carlos playing. And then this is when...
Yeah.
What's that?
Plus asking to the Hells Angels to assume the security was not the best idea.
Was not the best idea at all. And so this was when Mick Jagger was singing Sympathy for the Devil. That's when an African-American man in the crowd was stabbed to death. It was scary. And Mick Jagger was even telling the crowd to calm down, please, and he couldn't control them. I think this really shows the chaos that was what was happening at that moment. Jim's lifelong friendship with Miles Davis. This is the Isle of Wight in 1970. And it just is a beautiful portrait, I think, of Miles Davis. Jim also photographed the Allman Brothers Band, and this is their famous Fillmore East album cover. And they were notorious for never smiling, ever. So what Jim finally did was he said, okay, you guys, I'm the one who has the Coke. If you don't smile, you're not getting any. And then they started laughing, and he got the shot. He was very, very good friends with Duane Allman. And this is a famous shot in the bathroom where he was just practicing his guitar. Led Zeppelin in their limo on their way to a concert in Los Angeles. There was Dripping Springs, which was outlaw country music, and this was the concert when you went in, you were met by two police officers with rifles. But Dripping Springs was supposed to be the country Woodstock. And so they had this huge event in the middle of the field with dirt, and everybody, and it was not a success. The first one was not a success, but then it became, they decided to do a second one and third one. But again, this is the crowd. And so there's Chris Christopherson, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings, the big outlaw country movement. And Waylon Jennings without his beard and mustache, and the same with Willie Nelson with short hair. There he is. Leon Russell playing in the background. Here's Keith Richards. Jim was the official photographer for the Rolling Stones 1972 tour. And when they went into the recording studio, Sunset Studios, to record the vocals, re-record them, Jim was the only photographer there. And he captured this iconic one of Keith Richards. This was backstage. And again, what I love about Jim's photography is with music, he photographed live music and these musicians at the heights of their careers when they looked like giants, but he also photographed them as human beings backstage when they weren't performing, when they were waiting to go on for the next one. And I think this really captures that. This is Mick Jagger as a human being, not just as a rock and roll god. It's Keith Richards writing music. Here they are, their 72 tour. That's Robert Frank. And Robert Frank was filming Cocksucker Blues during the 1972 tour. And Jim captured Robert Frank talking with Charlie Watts.
What was Jim Marshall's relationship with others photographers of his time?
They all respected Jim because Jim, again, Jim just didn't photograph live music. He photographed what was happening around it and the people in quiet moments. And so they respected that Jim had that friendship with these people and was let into their lives and was able to photograph them in these different situations. And Jim never betrayed that trust. And I think that's why a lot of the photographers also really respected Jim, because, he did take photographs of them doing drugs and in precarious situations, but Jim would never think of ever letting those out and showing that to people. And so the photographers really respected not only Jim technically, because technically he was amazing, he was able to catch all these photographs, but also his integrity as a photographer.
Est-ce que, je pense, puisqu'on a vu la voiture de Janis Joplin tout à l'heure, j'aimerais parler de voiture parce qu'on en voit beaucoup dans le livre, notamment à l'intérieur de la couverture. Ce sont des photos intimes, personnelles, de famille. Et il y a des voitures qui reviennent tout le temps. Et à l'intérieur aussi, concernant Jim Marshall, j'aimerais que vous nous parliez de ces deux voitures parce qu'elles disent bien deux moments de la vie de Jim Marshall et vous avez plutôt connu le second. I'd like to talk about cars because we see them a lot in these personal photographies that are here inside the book. And these two cars are showing two different moments in Jim Marshall's life.
Yes.
You've known him maybe in this second part with the white truck.
Correct. I met him actually later than that.
Yes.
But yes, in the first one, Jim loved cars. The saying is cars, guns, and cameras. Cars and guns have gotten me in trouble. Cameras haven't. And he loved his cars. He really did. And he had a Shelby Mustang that he actually raced Steve McQueen when they were in San Francisco filming Bullet.
Oh, wow.
That's the Shelby Mustang that Jim raced. And according to Jim, he smoked him. He won. And interesting, true to Jim, the license plate was Gort. It's spelled Gort. One of his favorite movies of all time was The Day the Earth Stood Still. and the robot's name was Gort. So Jim had his license plate named Gort.
And what does the second car permitted him to do?
That was his truck. Jim got into a lot of trouble with drugs throughout his life, and he didn't have a lot of money. He had to be bailed out of jail a couple times, and so that was his beat up truck that he drove for a while. And that truck was good for him because he could haul around his equipment easily in the truck when he needed to go somewhere. But it also shows his love of the city, San Francisco. He was a native son and he always loved San Francisco.
Great. Mais je vois qu'on a passé une demi-heure. Je voulais demander aux membres du jury, à ceux qui sont dans la salle, si vous avez des questions pour Amelia Davis.
Merci Matthieu, justement j'allais en poser. Amelia, I have a question for you. You already did 5 Marshall's monographs. How this
Yes.
one is different?
This one is different because it combines all of Jim. It's more, I think, of a biography, whereas the other monographs showed specific parts of Jim's career. So it either concentrated on music, or it was, rock and roll or jazz. There was never really a book out there that encompassed all of Jim's life from start to finish. So you really get to see the man and understand who he was and why he took the photographs that he did because of how he grew up and how he viewed the world. So I think this as well brings in a lot of writings as well as photographs. And I think it really marries the two. So you get a really good idea of who Jim Marshall was, flawed and all. But I think there was a real need for this kind of book to explain who the man was and see who he was through the different photographs that he took.
And it's true that the book is very moving. Do you see in it a kind of nostalgia, maybe?
Nostalgia in the book, yes. It's for me, Jim he became a very good friend of mine, and I loved him and he loved me, and we had a very close friendship. So I think I saw sides of Jim that many people didn't see, and so for me it was very important in the book to show that and to look back and be nostalgic, like you said, about the different parts of Jim. And Jim was never ashamed of who he was. He may have had regrets, but he was never ashamed. And that's what I wanted to show in this book as well, the whole truth and not hide from the truth. Much like photography. Photography is very truthful. You can't hide from a photograph because it tells you the truth in it.
You were talking about moments. Did he used to take a lot of images, or he knew exactly what he wanted and finally he didn't take so much pictures?
No, Jim, like I said, Jim had 5 cameras around his neck with black and white film and color film. So he never wanted to miss a moment. So he would just constantly be photographing to capture what he saw and share that with the world. So, on one proof sheet, you can see 36 exposures on that one proof sheet. He may have picked the hero shot, but if you look at all the other shots on that proof sheet, each one of those could be hero shots as well, because he was technically so good that he knew once he clicked that photograph, once he did the shutter, he knew that what he was seeing would be on that proof sheet. And he didn't want to waste any film because early on, he had to buy and roll his own film, and it was very expensive. So he taught himself technically how to take the perfect photograph and never really waste a piece of film. But he also had a curious eye, like I was saying, and saw things that some people wouldn't see, like the peace symbol. Most people would just walk by it, but Jim saw it and understood that this was going to be something special, and so he decided to document it. So I think Jim, we have over 1 million photographs in the archive, just of black and white 35 millimeter alone, because he was always photographing.
Can we go back to Matthieu? Sorry. Why have you selected this book?
Alors moi j'ai choisi ce livre, déjà la première chose qui m'a attiré, en fait j'avais proposé un livre de Jim Marshall déjà il y a, je crois que c'était l'année dernière ou l'année d'avant, et c'était un ouvrage qui était spécifiquement centré sur les photos de Johnny Cash dans les pénitentiaires de Saint-Quentin et de Folsom. Et voilà, les photos de Jim Marshall, on les a tous vues ou appréhendées, mais c'était vraiment intéressant de comprendre qui il était, la nature de reportage dans le milieu du rock et du jazz que lui avait apporté. Et du coup, en tombant sur ce livre-là, vraiment, au début, c'est vraiment l'objet, voilà, ça, le simple fait d'avoir comme un appareil photo ou une guillotine qui m'a attiré. Et ce qui a retenu mon attention, vraiment, c'est tout ce qu'on pouvait découvrir sur le personnage, à la fois antipathique et très humain, puisque vraiment Amelia Davis a à cœur de d'écrire un personnage dans toute sa complexité, dans ses problèmes de drogue, dans ses crises parfois difficiles à gérer, le fait que c'était devenu quelqu'un de très isolé vers la fin de sa vie, et même s'il se croyait seul, ils s'apercevront après sa disparition, au moment où elle se retrouve à gérer tout cet héritage, qu'il était extrêmement apprécié et suivi, même si ses admirateurs étaient parfois distants.
Vous savez s'il a beaucoup d'expositions? Amelia, it's also a question for you. Does he has a lot of exhibition, Jim Marshall?
Yes, he does have a lot of exhibitions. One of the things when Jim passed away, for me to keep his legacy alive and to share it with the world, some of the best ways are through exhibitions, and also then books that go along with the exhibition. So for me, I try to put on a show a year, whether it's in galleries or museums, to broaden the public's understanding of who Jim was and what he photographed and how relevant, again, it is today, because, again, history repeats itself. And I think what was important to Jim was to portray these photographs as truthful as they are, and for them to inspire a whole new generation of photojournalists to use the camera as a tool to tell a story. And I think that's what this book does, and that's what Jim's photography does, is it inspires a whole new generation of photojournalists to really use their cameras as tools to show what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Do you have something to add? Or maybe we can conclude.
Moi, j'avais une chose à ajouter, c'est que vraiment, je trouve qu'il n'y a pas forcément, il y a une part de nostalgie à regarder ces photographies, mais il y a avant tout une vitalité que je trouve nécessaire encore aujourd'hui. On disait que les photos de Jim Marshall montrent une Amérique qui a tendance à se répéter sur les problèmes raciaux, les problèmes de pauvreté. Il y a quelque chose, encore un éclairage qui, je trouve, et peut être par certains aspects toujours pertinent aujourd'hui, mais surtout il y a une façon de regarder la musique et de la montrer à un moment où, ça encore une fois c'est très bien dit et raconté dans le livre, l'industrie musicale s'est énormément transformée à part quand Amelia Davis a rencontré Jim Marshall dans les années 90, ça avait complètement changé. Il n'y avait plus le rapport intime que les photographes pouvaient avoir avec les musiciens, et de ce fait la création est quelque chose d'observé de plus loin, et puis les images sont très contrôlées, et je trouve qu'il y a une vitalité à l'œuvre dans ce livre, voilà, qu'on trouve assez rarement. C'est pour ça que j'avais envie de les faire voir, ces images.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Voilà. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Salut à tous, on attend le résultat donc pour samedi à Perpignan. On croise les doigts.
Thank you for letting me share Jim's legacy with all of you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, bye bye.
Salut à toute l'équipe du FILAF.